talking about inflation, food prices, Ukraine and Russia, everything that goes into economics with Dr. Ian Sheldon. He is Anderson's Chair of Economics and Trade with Ohio State's College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. And Dr. Sheldon, a lot to uncover here. And before we get into the heavy lifts of inflation and food prices, I get asked a lot by the media about the lasting impacts of a couple of things, the pandemic and the Ukraine and Russia conflict. So let's start with the pandemic. What types of long-lasting scenarios are we seeing in our economy today because of the pandemic now?
Well, I think we're still seeing what happened with that global value chains is still washing out, particularly given that China is still essentially under lockdown. And remember, we have a lot of offshore assembly and production of goods in China that has slowed down tremendously. And of course, during the pandemic, we had folks switching to buying all kinds of equipment that they needed to use at home, which obviously put a lot of pressure on the value chains, and those value chains just choked up. I think in the automobile retail sector, we're still seeing a little bit of a problem there with, for example, buyers Subaru, who I buy my cars from. They keep asking me, do I want to sell them my car right back to them after less than a year, because I guess they're still short of models because they're short of largely the chips that go into the processor that runs all modern vehicles. And of course, the story about building the Intel plant here in Ohio, I think is all partly related to obviously issues relating to potentially China moving into that market and national security. But I think it's just about Intel diversifying its supplies and investing in plants here in the United States. So I think the shifts in demand and supply that we saw in the pandemic have more or less washed out, but I think we're still seeing some effects, particularly in the automobile industry and to some extent in the electronics industry, and that's largely driven by Japan. And of course, this is leading to a lot of discussion about how we're going to go forward for this. Now, I should point out that the high point of value chain growth was just before the financial crisis, and we saw a big slowdown in the contribution of value chains to international economic growth, and we haven't seen a clawback. And there's still quite a bit of debate amongst trade economists about what's likely to happen now. My own view is that it was very costly for American, European, Japanese multinational corporations to invest in offshore production, and if they walk away from it, that what economists call that the sunk costs. These are costs that they're never going to recoup. But if they build those, if they reshore, that's going to be new costs that they're going to have to incur. And the one thing I would note about if we do see much reshoring, I don't think it's necessarily going to bring back the kind of jobs that people think it will bring back. I think there's going to be a lot of automation, and I think that's going to be true. Certainly the automobile industry, I don't think this Intel plant is going to hire a huge number of workers. I'm not an expert in that. And I think even the meatpacking industry, which did suffer domestic value chain problems during the pandemic, I think we're going to see more automation in that industry in order that they can maintain their profit margins. So, and the other thing I think we'll see is, I think we'll see a bit of a move away from just-in-time inventories. We're going to see firms actually having a little bit more inventory storage capacity, which maybe so there's going to be maybe warehouses going up around the state for automobile parts or whatever that we haven't seen so much of since we went to extensive offshore in about the mid-80s onwards.
Dr. Sheldon and I talked very early on of the Ukraine-Russian conflict about what it meant for the global economy. Of course, we know they're a top 10 producer in corn and wheat. We know that many of the supplies needed to make fertilizers come from that part of the world. All these months later, getting into 2023, how much of that conflict is impacting our economy?
I think it's clearly impacting the global economy and the US economy in particular in multiple ways. Obviously, fertilizer prices. I think Iowa State did a study that the last 2 years we've seen fertilizer prices quadruple, but commodity prices have only doubled. So that's obviously putting a squeeze on farmers' margins, but also it potentially has the possibility of affecting yields if farmers start cutting back on applications relative to what OSU Extension tells Ohio farmers they should be doing. And I think there's a real concern in emerging economies that we're going to see a pullback in fertilizer consumption. And so I think that's one thing. And as you probably know, Russia is by the rules responsible for a large amount of both nitrogen fertilizers. So clearly that's putting pressure on fertilizer prices as well, because it's one of the few tools, I said this in my talk, that the Russians really have leverage, particularly in the European Union, is natural gas supplies. But coming back to commodity prices, markets clearly, particularly wheat, softened. But I think wheat prices are still a lot higher than they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. And what we're seeing is a lot of volatility, I think. So 2 weeks ago, when Russia said we're pulling out of the agreement, the wheat price went up, I think, 15 cents a bushel. And then within 2 days, the Russians said, no, we're going to continue the agreement. So the wheat price went down. But I think the wheat price and other commodity prices have definitely softened since the brokered trade agreement involving the United Nations, Turkey, Ukraine and Russia. And I think what would really help on the commodity price side is, and this is really what the Russians' beef is that there are no sanctions against Russian commodity exports, but the Russians are having a hard time getting grain out of Russia. They had a really good crop this year, and they're claiming that they're having problem getting fertilizers out. And you sort of the question you might raise is, well, why is that? They're not sanctioned, but I think from everything I've read is one of the big issues with getting grain out of the Black Sea is the willingness of the insurance companies to insure large merchant vessels going into a war zone. And we're talking about areas of the sea that were mined outside the ports, both by the Ukrainians and the Russians. There's always a risk of attack by the Russian Navy, etc., etc. And I think generally, even though there's no sanction against Russian exports, I think the insurers are basically voting with their feet. They're not willing to take on the risk, and maybe that risk premium that they're going to charge is so high that nobody's going to be willing to pay for it. So I think there's a real concern that even if you could get Russian grain out, that nobody actually wants to take it. And of course the agreement is about getting mostly getting Ukrainian grain out. So I'm a little bit worried that the agreement is going to lapse later on this month. But today's Farm.News out of Illinois, their lead story is that the Russians are willing to re-sign the agreement. So maybe some progress has been made on helping Russian grain get out as well. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about that, and I think that's why the futures markets are typically still quite volatile, even though we're nowhere near the heights of where we were back in May, April and February when we first talked about this. So I think the issue for American farmers, and I remember talking about this to you before, is this double-edged sword that, we've got high commodity prices, but as Dr. Kachova showed in her talk this morning, input prices are putting a lot of pressure on the bottom line for farmers. So, if fertilizer prices remain high and we've got this problem on the Mississippi River of not only getting grain out, I've heard of huge freight rate increases, and it's very slow, there's hold-ups, etc., because I guess the shipping lane is narrow and they're having to dredge it. But there's a real concern that I guess the fertilizers are in ports like New Orleans, so you've got to get them upstream. and there's a real concern about how that's going to affect costs of fertilizers on top of what's already happening. So, maybe you could make the argument, maybe the war's a bad thing for the Ukraine, but maybe it wasn't a bad thing for American farmers. But I think probably on balance, the cost price squeeze is pretty critical. Inflation broadly is feeding into the farm balance sheet, not just on fuel and fertilizers, but elsewhere. And add on to that, my guess is that the basis between a bushel of corn here on the river, on the Ohio River, say near Cincinnati, is going to be quite a big wedge between that and New Orleans. Why? Because of the insurance costs, the additional fuel costs of transporting it, the fact that the Mississippi River into which the Ohio flows is down. So I think, right now I'm somewhat sort of on the downside risk side, I think, from the impact of the war on American farmers. And I think the war is going to go into a stalemate, both because of the winter and because I think Ukraine may be reaching the end of its supply lines. They've got to cross the Dnieper River. I think there's a feeling that it's going to be a lot tougher to push the Russians any further back. And I guess they think they're going to train up more troops, but I'm not a military expert, so we'll have to see what happens there.
The elephant in the room when you talk to an economist these days is inflation. At 8.8% as we speak, have we seen the peak?
I think we have, and I probably was one of those economists who thought that inflation was transitory coming out of the pandemic, that we understood why it happened. But I think we've had, a perfect storm of events. I don't think we could have forecast, but we didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine. And I think that the effect on commodity prices caught a lot of us by surprise. But having said that, I think that at least in the developed world, the central banks are doing their job. And I'm pretty sure Dr. Partridge is talking about that right now. And as I showed you in my own slides, we've gone from rate cuts during the pandemic to pretty significant rate increases, and the Fed has been leading the way. Now that's creating an interesting debate, which I only really hinted at today in my talk, which is there are some macroeconomists outside of the United States who are saying, hey, we live in a global economy, everything the United States does feeds into the dollar, which then causes pain to us. And there's some truth in that, but I think most economists who work for the World Bank, the IMF, and other major government agencies suggest that the problem is that we don't deal with inflation in the developed countries. The global economic recession is potentially going to be greater. So I think that the argument is we have to find ways of helping those emerging economies, but central banks are going to have to continue to raise interest rates. But it certainly is the case that the rapid appreciation of the dollar is putting a lot of pressure on emerging economies and pushing many of them towards the 40-year debt.
All that has a huge impact on agriculture, but maybe none so much so as global trade, which has declined dramatically as well. In 2021, global trade was 10.1%. In 2022, projected at 2.5%. Have we seen the bottom there?
I think on trade, as we know, is a circular relationship. Trade causes growth, growth causes trade. So I think until we start to see the slowdown in GDP growth flatten out, I think trade's going to be sort of just chugging along. I mean, we have no reason not to trade, but of course as demand slows down, pulls back because of monetary tightening and fiscal tightening, I think we're going to see less international trade. Now, for agriculture, I couldn't find a global figure, but I could tell you sort of briefly what I know about US agricultural trade, and that is 2023 is a record. Now, of course, that's in dollars, so obviously that's you have to be able to tease out the difference between quantities of corn and soybeans being exported and the value of those. But I think USDA did forecast a pretty good year, and it pretty much turned out that way. But I noticed the latest USDA forecasts and the WASDE forecasts are that maybe US agricultural exports will slow down a little bit next year, and I think that goes back to my point about the reason we're seeing a pullback in global commodity prices, I mean they are softening, is that some of it's the macroeconomic pullback. And you tend to have, even though food is a necessity, you still get a pullback. People eat less in restaurants, less fast food, go for cheaper items in the supermarket. So I think there's going to be a dent to demand. It's not like what we had during the pandemic, where we switched from going out to eat in restaurants to eating at home and ordering Uber Eats or whatever. That's why we had that crunch in the domestic supply chain. I mean, interestingly, and you may remember a couple of my previous talks. During the pandemic, agricultural trade was really resilient, and of course, when China came back into the world market as it rebuilt its hog production capacity, particularly sucking in corn, soybeans, and latterly wheat. Because of even wheat being sucked into animal feed in China. China's the biggest consumer of wheat in the world for domestic reasons. That's why, that's why from the US-China Free Trade Agreement, the only real success story there was agriculture. Well, despite the pandemic, we almost hit the targets. We came pretty close. Now, was that because of the agreement? I think that's debatable. I think you had a big demand shock that led to them sucking in imports. Excuse me. So, where were we?
We were
on
talking
inflation.
about, yes.
Yeah, I think it's going to soften, but I think it's very dependent on central banks holding the course. And I know I was rude about the UK, but my point about being rude about the UK is that was about the most extreme policy mistake you could make. And the lesson to be learned there is if you can't have a monetary policy where you're raising short-term interest rates to squeeze inflation out of the economy, and then you have a government fiscal budget where you're going to cut taxes, you're going to raise spending because you want to achieve economic growth, but you're not going to say how you're going to pay for that. And so the market said, we don't know how you're going to pay for this. They're worried about what's called fiscal dominance, where the central bank ends up basically printing money to pay for that debt. The central bank is no longer able to do what it's supposed to do, which is to target inflation, and it's also supposed to target unemployment or employment. So I think to me that's an object lesson in you need to have coherence between the policy choices, and I think the Biden stimulus is probably still working its way through the economy, so that's still, the gentleman in the audience who asked me about prices, I think that's still feeding through a little bit, even though we are seeing rate of price increases coming down. Remember, inflation rate is about the rate at which prices are increasing. It's not that prices are coming down, it's the rate at which they're going up is coming down. And if you look at my food price forecast, it doesn't look like till 2024 that we're going to get down to a point where we have very low rates of increases in food price inflation. But I think if we can get global inflation and inflation in the US down to 4 or 5% in the next 12 months, we're heading in the right direction. But the Federal Reserve has to stick to its task, which is to do this balancing act between pushing up rates too fast and the stock market reacting negatively, but at the same time, we don't want to end up in a stagflationary situation where we potentially go into a recession and have inflation at the same time. And we haven't been in that situation since the late 1970s, early 1980s.
So bring inflation down, but make it a soft landing at the bottom. Dr. Ian Sheldon, one of the speakers here at Ohio State's Ag Policy and Outlook Conference here in Columbus. At the Ag Policy and Outlook Conference at The Ohio State University, I'm Ty Higgins. Brent Sohngen joins us. Your big talk, of course, was about energy. And the one thing that you mentioned that I think might catch some people by surprise, we talk about energy independence in the U.S. quite a bit. You say we're there.
We are. We're there with our total energy. We're not there with oil. We're pretty close. We're definitely there with natural gas. We're shipping more natural gas out of the country. You know, obviously with renewables and other kinds of things, those help out as well. But we've been there for a couple of years.
Where does renewable energy fit into the overall picture in the U.S. right now?
So renewables right now are about 8% of our total energy supply, and so they're a growing percentage. That's come up a lot in the last few years, and it's continuing to grow. So we would expect it to continue to grow.
Natural gas, a success story here in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, natural gas has been amazing. I mean, the last 15 years, ever since the fracking boom got going, especially here in the Midwest, not so much in the Midwest, but a little bit Mideast maybe, a little bit further east of here, in the Appalachian region, we've got a huge increase in natural gas production, which has nationally helped the U.S. sort of kick the coal habit.
What impacts our markets directly these days?
What impacts our markets with respect to energy consumption? Well, you know, the big effects right now are happening in Europe, right, with the Ukrainian war going on and really driving up natural gas prices. So we have huge increases in natural gas prices in recent years, but also we've seen it in the oil markets as well. Those will continue, but I think we'll see some abatement in those in the next year or so if we see, you know, a lot of people are worried about recession happening, and that's clearly on OPEC's mind as they sort of did an oil production cut that's going to hit us in the next month or so. But yeah, we're starting to see maybe some headwinds on the demand side, but we'll still see some high prices probably, but hopefully some abating of that in the next 6 months.
As far as agriculture goes, of course, we talk a lot about diesel fuel and a lot about fertilizer. Both fit into that energy category pretty heavily. Diesel prices remain pretty high. Why is that, and where do you see them going?
Yeah, diesel prices, you know, I expect they're going to start to come down a little bit here in the next 3 to 6 months. But they're still going to remain higher than the historical norm probably for the next year at least. And that until we see a real sort of play out in the market with respect to what's happening in Russia. You know, the big concern on actual oil markets has more to do with the supply side. Is how are we going to get some of these oil rigs back in the market? And we just, you know, we're nowhere near the levels we were a decade ago in terms of the number of oil rigs and natural gas rigs that are out there. And until those come back, until we see, you know, I don't know what the issue is. I kind of suspect it has more to do with labor than it has to do with anything else, that we just can't find the people to work those rigs. So until those sort of issues get worked out, I don't think we'll see big reductions in prices.
We saw a lot of increase in fertilizer prices over the last year, upwards, I heard, of 400% before we got to the middle of planting season earlier this year. They've leveled off. I say that tongue-in-cheek. They're still double what they were last year. A lot of energy inputs go into making those fertilizers. Where do you see fertilizers going? And can you talk about just exactly what you're looking for behind the scenes as far as those numbers go?
Yeah, so fertilizer prices, I suspect, well, they're going to probably take a little bit of a swoon here for the next 3 months or so, but I suspect as we move towards planting season, we'll see an uptick in prices again. You know, a lot of that's just going to have to do with heavy demand in the U.S. and the Northern Hemisphere as we start to move back into the planting season. There's so many different demands for this same material, right? Natural gas has become such an important commodity in so many different areas that we use it everywhere, and it's, you know, it's something that while we're seeing bigger supplies of it, you know, we're seeing bigger demands as well. So this is going to be a continuing issue, I think, in the agricultural sector, sort of managing and getting the expectations right, I think, on higher prices, because I think we're just going to have to expect those in the fertilizer industry.
A lot of what we know and see is all part of our perspective, and one of the things that you showed today that really surprised me is that about 1 in 10 cars on the road in the U.S. are electric vehicles or some type of hybrid. You might see that in California. You get in the middle of Ohio here, you might not see 1 in 10 cars, at least from our perspective. Where do you see the future of U.S. energy going?
Yeah, you know, I do want to correct on that. That's really 1 in 10 new car sales right now. So it's not 1 in 10 cars out there on the roads, but you see an increasing numbers of them out there. You know, in the U.S., we're going to see that just continuing to have an impact. But the big expectation in the energy transition is that we move from sort of an oil and gas dominated energy market to sort of an electricity and dominated energy market, which can be heavy in natural gas, but also heavier in renewables. So that's expected to play out over the next 10 to 15 to 25 years. We have to make a lot of changes, but the big thing there is that if we, you know, think how hard that would be for us to actually move from an oil-dominated transportation sector to an electricity-dominated transportation sector. So there'll be some massive investments that are going to happen, and we're going to have to see big new changes in the way consumers sort of have their expectations set about what they can do with their automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. So this will be interesting to see it play out. But it's happening right now. We're already seeing it. It's slower than what some people want, faster than what others want. But we're seeing it, right? In these electric cars that, they perform better in some ways and worse in others, right? You can't take long distance trips with them because you're worried about where you're going to charge them up, right? But you can certainly drive around, in your local community pretty easily with them, and a lot cheaper, because right now electric cars actually are cheaper than gas cars.
Farmers becoming also a big part of the equation when it comes to offsetting those energy markets. When it comes to carbon, we're hearing a lot more about that across the country as farmers take part in carbon programs. The one thing that really got my attention is that we see a lot of competition for farmland right now. You say that houses could be the least of our concern here in the near future.
Well, I think it's coming. It's a world that's coming with these sort of offsets, right? That I just think of all these companies out there that have made these net zero goals, and more than 70%, I think, of Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. and around the world have made sort of net zero goals where they want to get their net emissions to zero by 2030, 2040, somewhere in that range. In order to do that, we aren't going to make this transition to electrification in that period of time. So we're going to have, any oil that gets used, any natural gas that gets used, it's going to have to be offset with some kind of a deduction from the atmosphere in terms of the carbon. That can only happen through photosynthesis, which is what, it's what your farms do. I mean, farms are photosynthetic, manufacturing facilities. And so people are going to look to the farms to do that more and more frequently in the future. So it's just going to increase competition for land, basically.
Brent Sohngen with The Ohio State University, our guest from the Ag Policy and Outlook Conference in Columbus. I'm Ty Higgins. We'll see you down the road.